Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon we're going to be looking at another chest opening, and this is the Sicilian defense, the Maroczy Bind, and this is actually about alternative bishop e2 setups. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's see. White will start off by going e4, black goes c5, the normal Sicilian, knight f3, g6, d4, takes, knight c6, c4, and we have the Maroczy Bind. Now, after knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop e2, I went over a setup in my previous Maroczy Bind video where I basically talked about how black is going to play after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop g7, and white is actually just going to develop the bishop out to e3, bring the queen back to d2, and that setup where then you're going to go f3 and b3. Now, instead of that setup, we're going to be looking at two different setups where white is actually going to go castles and then has the option of going queen back to either e3 or queen to d3 once black castles. And another setup is where white goes bishop g5, and after black castles, white just brings the queen back to d2. And we're going to be looking at the bishop to g5 setup first because it's a lot more easier to understand. Black castles, and now white goes queen to d2. And now black develops the bishop out to e6. White plays rook c1, and the other option that you could also go for is castling as white. White goes for the move rook c1 though, and after queen to a5, putting pressure on this g5 bishop, black also has ideas of getting this a6 b5 advance in. And it's a pretty similar variation that we just saw in my last Maroczy Bind video. So white will go f3, defending the e4 pawn, and after rook fc8, you're attacking the c4 pawn, and obviously you're threatening to capture it with the bishop on e6. So white defends with b3, and black goes a6. Now obviously you're getting ideas of b5, and you're trying to get nice tactical ideas in. White goes knight a4, and now obviously you can't go b5 because your queen is hanging. So black trades the queens off and is not going to go b5 yet because there's still a threat of knight b6. So there are two ways to take care of this threat. And those moves are knight d7, which tries to simply guard the b6 square, and also rook c6. So both of these moves try to guard the knight from infiltrating to the b6 square. And we're first going to be looking at the move knight d7. If knight d7 is played, white goes g4. Why do you not capture the pawn on e7 as white? Well, because if you capture the pawn on e7, then black goes bishop h6 check. You've just given up the defense of this diagonal. And now, if you go f4, you're just giving up pawns unnecessarily. So you can either go king d1, king d3, king c3, or king c2. You can go any of those four moves, but no matter what you do, let's say you go king d3 here, then it just takes on c1, takes on c1, and unfortunately for white, black actually manages to get the very nice d5 move in. And you're not losing this pawn on d6, and you're not keeping it as an isolated pawn either. Instead, you're getting rid of the pawn. And unfortunately for white, you cannot capture with the c pawn because your rook is pinned. So you would have to play e takes d5, bishop takes d5, and black's pawn structure is pretty good now. So you simply cannot take on e7. It's just a terrible move. Now, that being said, what is white going to do? White is just going to go g4 for the similar plan that we saw in the previous video of the Maroczy Bind. f6, bishop goes to e3, and now f5. Obviously, you want to keep that bishop on g7 as active as possible because it's mainly the star piece of the entire Accelerated Dragon / Sicilian defense. And after f5, black has a very good game. You're just trying to get a very nice pawn break in, and black might think of capturing either e4 or g4 if white does not respond. And black is getting a pretty good game, and this knight can always come into e5 later on after you take care of the threat of knight b6. And black has lots of potential ideas in this position. And once this bishop also gets very active, black's pieces are just going to be excellent. So the other option instead of knight d7 is to go rook c6, which guards the b6 square by the rook. Now after knight c3, black goes king to f8, and you're trying to get the king as active as possible because for the moment it doesn't really deserve to be castled on the king's side. and placed on the wrong side of the board. So white goes knight d5, jumping the knight into the center, and black eliminates it with the bishop. And after bishop takes d5, c takes d5, black isn't going to trade the rooks. Instead, black is going to go rook c, c8. And these two bishops aren't really that impressive for white. They're not doing anything that's really spectacular, extraordinary, nothing like that. So white just doesn't have anything to really prove as compensation for black having this wonderful activity of pieces. Now, white does have the bishop pair, but how exactly do you activate that? It's going to be very hard to activate this bishop itself, and this bishop, what is it really doing? It's just staring down at this knight on f6, which I don't think you would really need to capture. So this would just be a better position for black, and that was the bishop to g5, followed by queen to d2 setup. Now, with that being said, there is also another setup we can look at, and that is just if white castles on move 9. Now, after white castles, black castles as well. And here, white has two moves to choose from, either queen e3 or queen to d3. And queen to d3 is the more easier one of the two moves, and if queen to d3 is played, black just develops the bishop out to e6. Normal ideas. And this is being seen throughout the Maroczy Bind, where you just bring the bishop out and you mainly eye the c4 pawn. After bishop e6, bishop e3 by white, knight d7, and now queen to d2. And after queen to d2 is played, black brings the knight out to c5. And there are obvious intentions with this. Mainly, bishop takes c3 and you lose the e4 pawn. So, white defends with f3. And after f3, a5, just controlling the idea of b4 from white. White goes b3 instead to try supporting the c4 pawn, and black develops the queen out to b6. Now, here you might be wondering, why doesn't white just go knight a4 and take advantage of this pinned knight? Well, because if knight a4 is played, then black is just fine with going queen to b4, and there's nothing wrong with black's position whatsoever. In fact, if you now capture on b4 with the queen, a takes b4. And now white is in a bit of trouble because your rook is being attacked on a1 from this g7 bishop. And it just goes to show how active white's pieces are compared to black's. I mean, black's pieces are extraordinary and white's pieces are just very ordinary. So after this, let's say knight c5, black will take the knight, and after, say, something like rook ad1, just b6, or even just rook takes a2, and look at black's position. Black has very active pieces. This rook is maybe going to come to the a file next. And how does white combat this? Not really an easy way to say. So, instead of going for knight a4, what is white going to do? Well, white is actually going to play the move rook a b1. And now rook f c8 by black. Still, you're not going to go knight a4 because that queen b4 idea lurks. And now, what happens if you go knight a4? Well, black actually decides to go back to b4. And what really does this achieve as black? Well, it has a very nice idea. If white decides to try winning material by playing queen takes b4, a takes b4, and then knight b6, thinking that black blundered the exchange, then white is in for a real surprise. After knight b6, black is just going to take the pawn on a2. And believe it or not, the position is actually completely equalized. After knight takes c8, what are you going to do here as black? You can just take the knight on c8. You could even take the bishop on e2. And what does black have? Black has a very active amount of pieces that compensate for the loss of black's material. So let's say you play the move bishop c8 just to get rid of that knight. Now look at black's rook. And if you combine it with this powerful bishop and maybe later on this knight, which has a lot of potential in the game, you can see that black's pieces have a big improvement when they're compared to white's pieces. So, that is why after rook a b1, rook f c8, and now knight d5, not knight a4. After knight d5, queen d8. It's very nice that you go queen d8 after you develop the rook, because now you don't have to worry about the rook being stuck on the f8 square and not really doing anything and not participating in the game at all. So white goes king to h1, and black here goes rook a to b8. And there are obvious ideas with this rook ab8 move, mainly to get this b5 move in, which is a very nice idea. And another idea with this rook ab8 move is to just sidestep from any forks that white might have with something like knight to b6 later on in the game. So after rook ab8, white goes bishop g5. And this is a pretty obvious idea. You're trying to threaten knight takes e7 and winning the rook. So black eliminates the knight on d5. Pushing f6 would just weaken your position, so instead bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and bishop f6. Now taking the bishop on f6 would only allow black to get a lot more control of the e-file, because mainly it would be completely open, and it's really black who can use the e-file efficiently. So bishop to e3, targeting the knight, and b6. So black defends, and now a4 by white. Now here you might be wondering, is there a very nice maneuver that black can play, like knight to a6, and then bring the knight to b4? Well, yes, the knight can do that maneuver, but the thing is that white's attack is also going to happen on the king side. So this little maneuver on the queen side isn't really going to change that attack. So instead, black is going to brace himself for the attack that white is about to initiate. Queen to f8. Very nice move. So after queen f8 is played, white goes bishop d1, reinforcing the b3 pawn in case the rook on b1 ever wants to move. Now after bishop d1 is played, black goes queen g7, and the queen is nicely protecting the king. Usually you don't see this setup very often in the Sicilian defense positions, but mainly the idea is to take advantage of this queen side, and if you consider how nicely this bishop is being used to target the queen side, then you can see how black is the one with the advantage. After something like bishop c3 and bishop b4, black's queen can later on infiltrate the queen side, and black has a very significant advantage here. Now, that was queen d3. And you could also go for the move queen to e3, which, after this is played, bishop e6, targeting the c4 pawn yet again. White plays bishop d2, and that was one of two moves. The other move that you could go for is rook to b1, and if this is played, then queen b6, trying to trade the queens off, but white isn't going to do that. Queen d3 instead, because taking the queen on b6 would just allow e4 to first of all be a little bit more weaker, and also another thing is that after queen takes b6, a takes b6, this b6 pawn is supporting the c5 square, which this knight has plans of going to after something like knight d7 and knight c5. So, that is why queen b6 wasn't played in the game, and instead why queen d3 was played. Trying to defend the c4 pawn, black goes knight d7 nonetheless, knight d5, targeting e7, and now bishop d5, e d5, and rook fc8. After rook fc8, queen h3 is played by white, attacking this knight on d7, and the knight goes to c5. After knight c5 is played, what are you trying to do? Well, you're trying to go knight e4, that's one thing, but you're also trying to bring the queen around to this side of the board, and this knight has a very strong grip towards the c5 square, and all the squares surrounding it. So the bishop comes out to g5, and obviously there are threats of bishop takes e7 and just winning a pawn. Black doesn't care though, and instead goes knight e4. The bishop goes back to e3. Why do you not capture the pawn on e7? That's what many people would be asking. Well, it's because after bishop takes e7, first of all, knight d2 can be played, and that forks both rooks on f1 and b1. But another thing is that black doesn't really care about the pawn on e7, because it only opens up the file in black's favor. So if anyone's going to be favored in a position like this, it's definitely going to be black. So bishop e7 is not really a very important move to consider, and that is why white is just going to go back to e3. Black plays bishop to d4, and instead of capturing the bishop on d4, white is actually going to play the move queen h4. And what does this do? Well, obviously, if you move this knight, let's say to f6, you lose the bishop on d4. So, what does black do? Well, black just takes the bishop on e3. Why do you not go f5 here as black? That may be another question you're asking yourself. Well, if f5 is played, then just bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and now white uses the d-file. And yes, the rook isn't really doing anything on the d-file at the moment, but given some time, white can definitely get a good position out of this very boring one. So, f5 was not played in the game, instead bishop takes e3. Now after this was played, obviously if you capture the bishop on e3, then queen takes e3 check, and you follow it up with capturing the bishop on e2, etc, etc. So, queen takes e4, capturing the knight, which was a very key piece in most of black's variations. Now black goes bishop d4 here, and you might be wondering, why doesn't black go bishop g5? Well, black is actually setting up a trap for white, and that is, if white were to capture the e7 pawn, then black just goes rook e8. And would you look at that? This bishop is completely unprotected, and it's being skewered to the queen on e7. So after, say, queen g5, you lose the bishop, the rook gets active, this other rook is coming into the game, and white is lost here. So queen e7 doesn't work, instead just b4, and after bishop f6, rook fc1, queen d4, a trade of queens, and black's position is relatively equal. You have ideas of going a5 and striking at this pawn, and mainly to open up the a file for yourself. But another thing is that black may get ideas of just bringing the king into the game and maybe doubling the rooks on the c file, and that too gives black some prosperous long-term initiative. So that was the move rook to b1. The other move is just to go bishop to d2, and after bishop to d2, queen to b6. After queen to b6, black offers the queen trade and has a very nice idea in plan, and you'll see this just shortly. After queen takes b6, a takes b6, white goes a4. The other move that white can try is f3, which would result in rook fc8, targeting the c4 pawn, b3, and now knight d7, yet again trying to use the c5 square. And you'll see that is a very key theme or motive in this opening, where black mainly tries to aim for the queen side play in the Maroczy Bind, because the king side is usually very shut off and cannot really do anything on the king side. So a4, b5. This is a very nice idea. Why do you not go for something like knight c5 here? Well, because white can just defend the b3 pawn, and the knight's power on c5 is completely useless. But black plays a very brilliant move, and that is b5, because the b5 square is defended 3 times, 4 if you include this bishop on e2. But the point is that black isn't really looking at the value of protection the square has. He's instead looking at future piece play. And it doesn't matter how you take with this knight or the c-pawn, you would be losing material. If you take with the knight, then you lose the rook on a1, and if you take with the c-pawn, then you lose the knight on c3. In either case, white is losing material. So a takes b5. Now what does black do? Black goes for the move knight c5. Very nice move indeed. And after this knight c5 move is played, rook takes a8. And now after rook takes a8, rook b1 is played. Now, what is the idea of trading the rooks, and why did you not just defend the b3 pawn? Well, the thing is, if you try defending the b3 pawn with rook a b1, this rook just gets active with rook a3. So it would only help black in any case, and black doesn't need to really be up material to know that he's winning. In this specific case, black just having active pieces is enough to prove to white that white does not have anything here. So rook takes a8, rook takes a8, rook b1, and now rook a3. Black is eventually going to win the b3 pawn back, if not just get a very active position and pacify all of white's pieces. So after rook a3, usually if you try playing something like bishop to d1 to defend the b3 pawn, then black has a very nice tactic in mind, and I encourage you to pause the video and try finding out what it is. Okay, so the correct move is actually just to go bishop takes c4, and after this is played, you cannot take the bishop on c4 because you can just lose your knight on c3. And after this, black regains the pawn, and black has no trouble converting the position whatsoever. This bishop is a terrible bishop. It's just going to be blocked in for actually the rest of the game. And if you don't do anything here as white, then black's position will just slowly improve and improve. And what does white do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing is available for white. So f3 is one move, but the other option is just to go a4, and now knight d7. Trying to bring the knight into c5, and also then later on to b3, because, well, b3 is extremely weak. After rook a3 is played, knight c5. And black has intentions of playing bishop takes c3, and then capturing either a4 or e4 from white. And unfortunately, white cannot stop both threats at the same time. So, what is white going to do? Rook fa1, trying to guard the a4 pawn. Now, after bishop takes c3, knight takes e4, black eliminates a pawn. After bishop d4 now, here many players would most likely consider going knight c5 and then retreating the knight back to d7, knowing that you won a pawn. Black is obviously going to have a good game for perhaps the rest of the game. However, black is going to instead go rook fc8. And this is something you should know. With rook fc8, obviously there are threats of bishop c4, just winning the pawn if you are going to capture the b6 pawn as white. So white actually goes rook to e3. And the obvious intention is to try capturing the knight on e4. However, in this position, when it seems like the best thing to do is just to retreat the knight, what does black do here? I'll give you some time to think about it. Okay, so black is actually just going to go bishop takes c4. Why is bishop takes c4 being played when the knight is clearly being hit on e4? Well, because if rook takes e4 is played here, then there's just bishop takes e2. And it doesn't matter if you also just play the move bishop takes c4 here, you're still going to lose. And why is that? Well, if bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, and now if you capture this knight on e4, then what does black do? Well, first of all, black could go e5, but another move is just simply to capture the pawn on a4 with the a rook. And after this, you cannot capture the rook on a4 because there's rook c1, and that is going to lead to checkmate. And after rook a takes a4, if rook d1 is played, then you simply now go e5. Because you're going to trade more pieces off, and let's say b3, for instance, rook takes d4, and now we just trade all the rooks off, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, e takes. If you notice the amount of material, we see that black is actually up 3 pawns, and has a very, very easy strategy of winning. Just simply bringing the king into the game, maybe capturing this b3 pawn, and what does white have? Yes, black has 2 pairs of doubled pawns, but that doesn't matter in this specific case, because black has 3 extra pawns, and white does not have any easy way of winning, so black is the one who is better here. And if you try rook takes e4, then black just takes on e2. And best move is to go bishop c3, because if you play the move rook takes e2, then what does black do? Well, black just captures on a4. And how is this winning for black? Well, because first of all, you cannot capture on a4 because back rank issues. And if you try defending this rook with rook e to e1, then there's rook takes d4. You lose your bishop. And finally, you cannot go rook a d1, and you cannot go rook d1 because there's rook takes d4 and still back rank issues. And you cannot even try this move b3, which tries to defend the rook here because first of all, you can capture the bishop on d4, but you could also just deliver mate after rook a1, bishop a1, rook c1, and then this is just going to lead to mate. So that means that after bishop takes e2, best is to just play the move bishop c3, or at least if you're going to capture the bishop on e2, be ready to be down a few pawns as white. So that was the alternative setups for 7 bishop to e2. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section, and stay tuned for more chess.